Imagine a time before the might of Rome stretched across the Mediterranean. A time when the Italian peninsula wasn't a single unified land under the eagle standard, but a patchwork of tribes, cultures, rivalries, and ambitions. Long before Roman generals carved their names into history, there were other warriors, fierce, disciplined, and utterly alien to the Roman way. Among them stood a people whose name would echo through the early centuries of the Republic with both fear and respect: the Samnites. These weren't distant barbarians at the edge of the known world. They were Rome's neighbors. And in some ways, they were its mirror, strong where Rome was weak, bold where Rome was cautious, and determined to defend their rugged homeland in ways that would change Roman warfare forever. This is the story of Rome's early nemesis, a story of mountains, sanctuaries, alliances, and brutal wars that forged the Roman Republic's military machine. Welcome to Part 1: Before the Legions, the Rise of the Samnites. When we think of Italy in the ancient world, our minds often jump immediately to Rome. Marble temples, disciplined legions, emperors draped in purple. But rewind to the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, and the peninsula looks nothing like that. This is a land divided. The Etruscans dominate the north. Sophisticated, urbanized, and culturally rich. To the south, Greek colonies dot the coasts of Magna Graecia. Between them, scattered inland among hills and valleys, are Italic peoples: Oscans, Umbrians, Sabines, and others. Speaking related languages, practicing similar religions, but politically fractured into tribes and confederations. And somewhere in the central Apennine Mountains, a rugged, isolated territory, lived a people known to the Romans as the Samnites. The Romans didn't conquer them overnight. In fact, before the wars that made them enemies, Rome and Samnium existed side by side, occasionally cooperating, sometimes clashing indirectly, but always watching each other closely. If Rome was like a rising urban power, drawing strength from fertile plains and trade, the Samnites were like mountain wolves, strong, independent, deeply tied to their rugged homeland. The Samnites were part of a larger linguistic and cultural family, the Oscan, speaking peoples of central and southern Italy. Their homeland, Samnium, was not one unified state, but a geographic region defined by the mountains themselves. If you were to look at a map, you'd find Samnium nestled between Latium to the north, Apulia to the southeast, and Campania to the southwest. It was a land of deep valleys, steep ridges, and winding rivers. Its terrain made large-scale agriculture difficult but provided natural fortresses. In these hills, the Samnites built hilltop villages, small, fortified communities perched on strategic heights. Roads were few. Travel was hard. And that difficulty shaped their society. Unlike Rome, which from early on concentrated power in a single city, the Samnites existed as a confederation of tribes. The Pentri, considered the leading tribe, centered in the highlands, the Herpini, whose name meant wolf people, the Caracini, the Caudini, and others. Each tribe had its own local leaders and assemblies, but during times of danger or war, they united, not under a king, but through alliances and shared identity. This flexible structure would later prove both a strength and a weakness in their conflicts with Rome. Culturally, the Samnites were hard, austere people, farmers, shepherds, and warriors. Life in the mountains was tough. Survival depended on community and discipline, and like many Italic peoples, their values centered on courage, loyalty, and the sacredness of oaths. We know about them partly through Roman writers like Livy, who, while biased, gives us glimpses of a society that commanded respect even from their enemies. Archaeology fills in the rest. Hillfort remains, tombs with grave goods, weapons, and inscriptions in the Oscan language. These weren't a forgotten backwater. By the time Rome began expanding southward, the Samnites were a serious regional power, with warriors trained in mountain warfare, and a confederation capable of fielding large armies when united. Religion for the Samnites was not something practiced in grand temples like in Greece or Rome. Their faith lived in the land itself, in sacred groves, mountaintops, and natural springs. They worshipped a pantheon of Italic deities, many with similarities to Roman gods, but with local flavors. Mamert, akin to Mars, was the god of war and manly virtue. Herentes, reminiscent of Hera or Juno, held sway over community and fertility. And Jovian or Uvian, connected to the sky and oaths, oversaw treaties and divine justice. But the truly fascinating part of Samnite religion is how public life and religious life merged. Political assemblies often took place in sanctuaries, and major decisions were made under the watch of the gods, often accompanied by oath, taking rituals that were binding and sacred. The Samnites were known for their sacred springs, tradition, groups of young men, bound by religious oaths, leaving their homeland to found new colonies. This practice, called versacrum, was both a religious act and a tool of expansion. Imagine a band of sworn youths, leaving their villages under divine guidance, seeking new lands to settle, a kind of Italic rite of passage that sometimes turned into the founding of new communities. This was not mythology. It was a real, structured institution that shaped the migration and expansion of Oscan peoples. Their sacred sites were often mountain sanctuaries, where tribes would gather not just for worship, but for political alliances and military mobilization. Some of these sanctuaries, like those later discovered at Pietrabondante, were monumental, with stone theaters and temples. A reminder that the Samnites weren't just warriors, but also builders of sophisticated religious centers. Religion bound their society together. It gave legitimacy to political decisions, unity to scattered tribes, and ferocity to their warriors, who believed they fought under the gaze of powerful gods. When the Romans eventually clashed with the Samnites, they weren't just fighting men. They were confronting a people whose identity was fused with their land and their gods. But religion and culture were only part of the story. Beyond the sacred groves and hilltop villages, the Samnites were slowly centralizing, building sanctuaries that doubled as political hubs. And on the western plains of Italy, a city named Rome was growing stronger, bolder, and hungrier. Two powers, one rising from the plains, the other from the mountains. Their inevitable clash would reshape the Italian peninsula forever. While the Samnites maintained their tribal identities, something was changing. Across the rugged landscape of Samnium, new religious and political centers began to emerge. These weren't cities in the Roman sense, but they were more than simple villages. They were sanctuaries, sacred gathering places where tribes would meet, make decisions, and renew their shared identity. Over time, these sanctuaries became the backbone of a more cohesive Samnite world. They provided the political glue that could unite scattered highland tribes into a force capable of challenging Rome itself. Pietrabondante stands as the clearest example of this transformation. Perched high on a mountain ridge, this sanctuary complex, uncovered by archaeologists centuries later, included monumental temples and even a stone theater. It was a place for ritual, yes, but also for assembly. Imagine tribal elders and warriors, wrapped in cloaks, climbing narrow mountain paths to gather here. Fires burning in the cold night air, oaths spoken under the stars, disputes settled, alliances forged. Here, Samnite identity was not just preserved, it was sharpened. As the Samnites strengthened their internal bonds, Rome was undergoing its own evolution. What had once been a modest city-state in Latium was rapidly expanding. Its military was no longer a collection of citizen farmers defending their homes, but an increasingly professionalized force, hardened by wars against neighboring Latin cities, the Etruscans, and various Italic peoples. By the mid-4th century BCE, Rome's influence was stretching southward toward Campania, a fertile, wealthy region that was about to become the flashpoint between these two rising powers. Campania was a land of opportunity. Its plains were rich, its cities prosperous. One of these cities, Capua, was among the most significant urban centers in Italy outside of Rome. But Capua had problems: pressure from Samnite groups in the surrounding hills. In 343 BCE, the Campanians appealed to Rome for protection against Samnite incursions. This single diplomatic move would ignite decades of warfare between Rome and Samnium. For Rome, this was a chance to extend its power southward. For the Samnites, it was a challenge to their dominance in the mountains overlooking Campania. Neither side was prepared to back down, and so began what historians call the First Samnite War. It was, by later standards, a relatively limited conflict. But it was significant because it marked the moment when Rome and Samnium stopped being wary neighbors and became open enemies. Roman forces marched south to aid the Campanians, defeating Samnite forces in a series of battles. Ancient sources, especially Livy, paint the Roman victories in grand terms: consuls winning triumphs, armies routing their foes. But we should remember that these accounts are often propagandistic. The reality was likely messier: two powerful Italic peoples testing each other's strength for the first time. The war ended with a treaty in 341 BCE. Rome had proven itself a formidable opponent, but it was not yet ready to push deep into Samnite territory. Both sides agreed to terms, and for a brief moment, peace returned. But this peace was fragile. Even as the ink dried on their treaty, Rome became embroiled in the Latin War, fighting against its former allies among the Latin cities. The Samnites, wisely, stayed out of that conflict, even aligning with Rome to contain the Latins. But the underlying tension never went away. Two powers, growing, expanding, circling each other like wolves in the night. It was only a matter of time before the next war erupted, and when it did, it would be far bloodier. By 327 BCE, the stage was set for a second, much longer conflict. The Second Samnite War would last over 2 decades and test Rome's very survival. Its spark came from the city of Neapolis, modern Naples. Neapolis found itself caught between Roman influence and Samnite pressure. When Rome intervened and took control of the city, the Samnites saw it as a direct encroachment into their sphere of influence. War was inevitable. The Second Samnite War was not fought in open plains where Roman legions could easily maneuver. It unfolded in the mountains of Samnium, a terrain that favored the defenders: narrow passes, steep valleys, treacherous paths. It was a kind of warfare that tested Roman adaptability. The Samnites excelled in this environment. Their warriors, lightly armed and swift, could ambush Roman columns, melt into the hills, and strike again. For Rome, accustomed to more structured battlefields, this was a nightmare. The early years of the war saw Rome struggling. Its armies suffered setbacks in the rugged heart of Samnium, unable to bring the Samnites to decisive battle. Samnite resistance was mobile, decentralized, and rooted in intimate knowledge of their homeland. But Rome was persistent. Year after year, consuls marched their armies into Samnium, building roads and forts, trying to pin down their elusive enemy. This was not just a war of soldiers, it was a war of endurance. And then came one of the most famous and humiliating moments in Roman military history: the disaster at the Caudine Forks. It was 321 BCE. A Roman army led by the consuls Titus Veturius Calvinus and Spurius Postumius Albinus was marching through the Apennines when it was lured into a narrow mountain pass near Caudium. The Samnites, under their commander Gaius Pontius, executed a brilliant plan. Disguised shepherds misled the Roman scouts into believing a Samnite force was besieging the nearby city of Lucera. The Romans, seeking to relieve their supposed allies, took the shortest route, the Caudine Forks. This was a trap. The pass narrowed between steep hills. The Roman column entered, perhaps unaware of the danger until it was too late. Once deep inside, the Samnites blocked the exits, trapping the Roman army like a wild beast in a cage. They controlled the high ground. The Romans were helpless. There was no way to fight their way out, no battlefield to deploy their formations. Days passed. Supplies dwindled. Negotiations began. Gaius Pontius faced a decision. He had tens of thousands of Roman soldiers at his mercy. His father, a seasoned veteran, advised him that only two choices made sense: release them unharmed to earn lasting peace, or kill them all to cripple Rome's power. Pontius chose a middle path, a decision that would echo through history. He forced the Roman army to surrender and undergo a ritual humiliation. Stripped of their weapons and armor, the Roman soldiers were made to pass under a yoke, a symbolic act of total submission. It was a devastating blow to Roman pride. Imagine the scene: proud Roman officers, consuls included, walking bent under a wooden yoke while Samnite warriors watched from the ridges above. The sound of jeers, the clatter of discarded armor. For Rome, this was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological wound. The Republic had been humbled in a way it had never experienced before. The aftermath of the Caudine Forks was complicated. The Roman Senate refused to ratify the humiliating peace terms signed by their consuls, arguing that the agreement had been made under duress. The consuls were handed over to the Samnites as a symbolic gesture, but Gaius Pontius, disgusted, rejected the offer. War resumed. But something had changed. Rome, stung by humiliation, began to adapt. It was during this period that the Roman military underwent significant structural reforms. Confronted with the challenges of mountain warfare, the Romans developed the Manipular legion, a more flexible formation than the traditional phalanx they had previously used. The Manipular system broke the army into smaller, more maneuverable units called maniples, arranged in a checkerboard pattern. This allowed Roman forces to operate more effectively in the broken terrain of Samnium. The Samnites had forced Rome to evolve. The Second Samnite War dragged on. Rome built the Via Appia, the famous Appian Way, to ensure reliable communication and supply lines to the southern theater of war. One by one, Samnite strongholds were attacked. Slowly, methodically, Rome ground down its enemy. The Samnites remained fierce fighters, launching raids and ambushes, but the tide was turning. Rome's relentless campaigning, logistical superiority, and political will began to outweigh Samnite advantages. By 304 BCE, after years of brutal fighting, both sides were exhausted. A peace treaty ended the Second Samnite War. Rome emerged stronger. It had not conquered Samnium outright, but it had survived, adapted, and expanded its influence into Campania and beyond. The Samnites remained independent, but their power had been checked. The rivalry was far from over. The mountains still stood, and in their shadows, the Samnite Confederation was not yet broken. The stage was set for an even greater confrontation. The First and Second Samnite Wars had transformed Rome. What had once been a regional power was now a force capable of sustained military operations over difficult terrain and long periods. Its army was evolving into the legendary machine that would one day dominate the Mediterranean. But the Samnites were not passive spectators to their own decline. They were fierce, proud, and determined. And when the Third Samnite War came, they would form alliances and fight with everything they had left. The Caudine Forks had been a humiliation, but it was also a turning point. Rome's response to defeat was not despair but reinvention. The Manipular legion that emerged from these wars would go on to conquer vast territories. The Samnites had unwittingly trained the very army that would one day destroy them. The conflict was not finished. There was still one great showdown to come, one that would draw in not just Samnites and Romans, but Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls as well. A massive coalition would face Rome in a climactic battle that would decide the fate of the Italian peninsula. By the dawn of the Third Samnite War, Rome and Samnium had already blooded each other for decades. Both had adapted, both had changed, but only one could dominate the heart of Italy. The peace after the Second Samnite War was more of a pause than a resolution. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Rome continued to grow, establishing colonies in Campania and Apulia, tightening its grip on strategic points. The Samnites watched this expansion with a mix of resentment and urgency. They understood that Rome's growth meant their eventual subjugation, and so they prepared for one last desperate confrontation. The spark came in 298 BCE. Roman expansion into the territory of the Lucanians, a people living to the south, brought Rome into conflict once again with Samnite interests. When the Lucanians appealed to Rome for protection against Samnite aggression, it was almost a mirror image of the situation in Capua decades earlier. Rome accepted, sent envoys to the Samnites, and demanded they leave Lucanian lands. The Samnites refused. To them, Rome was no longer a cautious neighbor, it was an imperial power encroaching deeper into their sphere. War broke out. But this war would be different. It was not just Samnites versus Romans. The Samnites, recognizing the scale of the threat, reached out to other peoples who shared their anxieties about Roman expansion. The Etruscans, once dominant in central Italy but now facing Roman pressure. The Umbrians, dwelling in the Apennines to the north. Even groups of Gauls, the fierce tribes who had once sacked Rome itself in 390 BCE, these groups formed a loose coalition. If Rome could be struck simultaneously from multiple directions, perhaps it could be crushed before its power became unstoppable. Rome, for its part, recognized the danger. A broad coalition of Italy's northern and central peoples, combined with the fierce Samnites, was a threat unlike anything they had faced before. The Third Samnite War would be a massive, multi-front struggle that tested Rome's capacity for coordination, strategy, and resilience. Battles erupted across the peninsula. Roman consuls led armies into Etruria to contain the northern threat, while other legions engaged the Samnites in the south. Roads, alliances, logistics, all the machinery of the Republic was put to the test. In 295 BCE, events reached a climax near a small town in Umbria, Sentinum. Here, one of the largest and most consequential battles of the early Roman Republic would take place. Two Roman consular armies, under Quintus Fabius Maximus Rolianus and Publius Decius Mus, faced the combined forces of Samnites and Gauls, supported by Umbrians and Etruscans. The stakes were existential. If Rome lost here, the coalition could pour into Latium, perhaps even march on Rome itself. If Rome won, the Samnite resistance would be fatally weakened, and the coalition would collapse. The battlefield was chaotic. On one side, disciplined Roman maniples, now veterans of decades of mountain warfare, arranged in their flexible checkerboard formations. On the other, wild Gallic warbands with massive shields and long swords, alongside determined Samnite infantry, clad in their distinctive armor, fighting to preserve their independence. The clash was brutal. Gallic charges slammed into Roman lines with terrifying force. Samnite formations pressed relentlessly, exploiting every gap. The Roman left wing, commanded by Decius Mus, began to falter under the combined pressure of Gauls and Samnites. It was then that Decius Mus made a decision that would echo through Roman legend. Following a tradition established by his father, Decius Mus performed a devotio, a ritual act of self-sacrifice to the gods. Dressed in full armor, he rode out before the enemy, invoked the infernal deities, and charged headlong into the Gallic lines, sacrificing his life to secure divine favor for Rome. The Roman soldiers, witnessing their commander's heroic death, were galvanized. Morale surged. The line held. Meanwhile, on the Roman right, Quintus Fabius Maximus maintained a calculated defense, waiting for the perfect moment. He ordered his cavalry to exploit a gap in the enemy's flank. Roman horsemen crashed into the coalition's side, throwing the Gauls and Samnites into disarray. The disciplined Roman maniples pressed forward. The battle turned. Slowly but surely, the coalition began to break. The Samnites, despite their ferocity, could not hold against Rome's relentless, coordinated assault. The Gauls wavered. The line crumbled. Sentinum became a killing ground. When the dust settled, the coalition was shattered. The Samnites had thrown everything into this final gamble, and they had lost. The Battle of Sentinum was not just a Roman victory. It was a decisive moment in the unification of Italy under Roman control. After Sentinum, the Etruscans sued for peace. The Umbrians retreated. The Gauls dispersed northward. The Samnites, though not yet fully conquered, were now fighting alone. The final years of the Third Samnite War were a grim mopping-up operation. Roman legions moved systematically through Samnite territory, capturing hill forts, besieging towns, and crushing resistance. There were no more great pitched battles. Instead, there was relentless attrition. By 290 BCE, the Samnites finally submitted. Rome had won. The mountain warriors who had once humiliated Roman consuls at Caudine were now subjects of the Republic. But conquest did not mean annihilation. Rome was pragmatic. The Samnites were not wiped out, their lands were integrated into the Roman sphere. Roman colonies were established. Roads were built. Latin became the language of administration. Over time, Samnite elites were drawn into Roman political and military structures. Their young men fought in Roman armies. Their gods mingled with Roman ones. The process of Romanization began, not overnight, not without resistance, but steadily decade after decade. And yet, the Samnite spirit did not disappear completely. Centuries later, during the social war in the early 1st century BCE, Samnite communities would rise again against Rome, demanding citizenship and autonomy. Even after centuries of subjugation, their identity still burned. But their moment as Rome's great rival was over. The wars with Samnium had forged the Roman Republic into something far more formidable than it had been before. These conflicts were the crucible in which the Roman military system was hardened. The Manipular legions, born from Samnite struggles, would one day conquer the Mediterranean. Think about the arc of this story. A highland people, fierce and proud, nearly brought Rome to its knees. They humiliated its armies, forced it to change, and delayed its rise for decades. And in doing so, they created the very machine that would eventually crush them. The Samnite Wars are not as famous as Caesar's conquests or Hannibal's campaigns, but in many ways they are just as pivotal. Without these wars, Rome might never have become the superpower of the ancient world. If you've made it this far, you've just journeyed through one of the most intense and transformative conflicts of early Roman history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps this documentary reach more history lovers like you. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming episodes, where we'll explore more forgotten wars, lost civilizations, and the turning points that shaped our world. And tell me in the comments, if you were a Roman commander facing the Samnites in their mountain strongholds, what strategy would you have chosen? History isn't just dates and names, it's a battlefield of ideas, decisions, and human will. And here, in the rugged hills of Samnium, Rome was forged.